Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the National Gallery for inviting us to the panel today and for us to be a part of this larger series of conversation on art and art practice that you have organized for the month of April. Thank you all for coming. And of course, thank you to the panelists for today. Our panel focuses on what it means to practice art today, the forms and formations of art making, the interest and urgency in creating a socially engaged art, and how recent social and ecological conditions have inspired the ways in which we think about art and its possibilities to imagine the future and reshape social relations. Our esteemed multidisciplinary panelists, Ibrahim Mahama, Deborah Anzinger, and Olu Oguibe, will be briefly introducing their work, after which we will open the conversation to questions from our audience. Just a sort of quick introduction, if I may. Ibrahim Mahama recently named the 2020 Prince Claus laureate is an interdisciplinary artist whose work often sort of utilize, manipulate, and transform used and worn materials such as jutsa and architectural spaces, and present them as objects and sites of contemplation of post-independence, the post-independence experience of Ghana and the ways those experiences intersect with global economic and political processes and histories. Mahama is also the founder of the Savannah Center for Contemporary Art in Tamale, Ghana, committed to the development of contemporary art in Ghana. Deborah Anzinger is a multidisciplinary artist as well, whose artworks engage the relationship between our contemporary racial and gender positionings to the ecological, the colonial, the mythic. Her paintings, videos, and sculptures were recently shown at the Perez Art Museum's 2019 exhibition, The Other Side of Now, and in her one-woman show at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia. Anzinger is also the founder of New Local Space, NLS, in Jamaica, and provides support for experimentation in contemporary art through exhibitions and residencies. And of course, encourage critical writing and conversations on art practice through their programs. Lastly, Olu Oguibe is a multimedia artist like the other panelists and writer, and former professor of painting whose career spans over several decades. His conceptual and minimalist works straddles the personal and the social. Widely exhibited, he has also created several public works, which we'll see today. In 2017, his Strangers and Refugees Monument, a public sculpture in Castle, Germany, received the Arnold Road Prize for Documenta 14. This work is just one of his career-long sustained interest in memory and memorialization. So today, we will talk about their practices generally, and I really hope this is supposed to be a conversation, so I hope you all, the audience, come with enriching conversations or enriching questions for our conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ibrahim, and he's going to present his work.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's very lovely to see all of you. I haven't seen my big brother Prof. Olu in a long time, so yeah, I'm very glad to see him. Yeah, after such a long period, and it's the first time I'm meeting most of you, so I'm very glad to meet you too, and hope that we can continue the conversation beyond this point. Thank you for inviting me. So to talk about the work and also the practice within the last couple of months or the last 1 year. For some reason, I thought that the pandemic for me was kind of a gift because I was traveling too much, and the coronavirus allowed me to stay at home and to concentrate and to find my thoughts. I think that I have had more clarity in this last 1 year than I have in my entire life as an artist. So I'm really glad for it. So I'll just go straight into the work. I think I'll share my screen and then, yeah. Is it full screen? Is it showing? Okay, thank you. Yeah, so My work as an artist, clearly in the last 8 years, I've been doing these installations around different cities in Ghana and also internationally. It was originally born out of my experiments into collecting materials around the city in both Kumasi, where I studied at the Kwame Nkrumah University, and also in Accra, experimenting with like architecture and all that. So I started by working with the jute sacks, which are originally produced in India and Bangladesh, and I brought into Ghana for the transportation of cocoa. You know, historically, Ghana was the largest producer of cocoa in the 20th century. So my interest in the material was one which was very political, but I was also interested in the material, the jute sack, in relation to the history of architecture, because the jute sack, the commodities which are contained within the jute sacks were historically supposed to have been stored in these massive grain silos, which were built in the 60s in the post-independence era. But a lot of architecture, as we know on the continent, was abandoned after like the post-independence era, after the likes of Nkrumah and the rest started building these spaces. So uh, that's why I mostly say that failure is a starting point for my work, because I'm mostly looking at spaces and how that can inform the kind of work that I produce. So there is this series of buildings, which are these silos that were built within that period. And last year during the pandemic, I actually, the city of Tamale, like the government was actually selling off one of these buildings. So through the artwork itself, I try as much as possible to intervene within like the already existing conditions, spaces and all that. So I bought one of these spaces to see if we could convert it into a cultural institution, thus turning it into like an urban agricultural space, and also like a greenhouse together with like a cultural institution and all that. Um, a couple of years ago, I was sewing my jute sacks and covering these spaces with them, because I was trying to re-establish a conversation between the material and then these spaces as they are. But as the pandemic hit and as I began to look at my practice more, I realized that the interventions I was doing went beyond just the symbolic act of an artist producing an artwork for an audience to experience. But I began to realize that I was much more interested in a certain fundamental change within the system, together with the architecture and everything that it presented. So I started working with a group of young men, like the many collaborators I've worked with in the past, to actually intervene within this space, to re-excavate it and to bring it back to life in a different way. Of course, in my work, I'm very much interested in the history of labor. So I've always taken ideas from like the railways, the history when it was built by the British. I constantly go back and forth in between the spaces, photographing, trying to find inspirations, ways in which we can draw from it, which we can use to construct spaces. The railway space in Sekondi, which was built by the British in the late 19th century, was actually what inspired me to build the Savannah Center for Contemporary Art in Tamale. Because I was interested in how this space, because before the birth of modern art even, how these spaces were functioning. And even in contemporary art, if you're looking at institutions on the continent, you don't even have, there are rarely these type of institutions which can contain maybe certain kinds of objects that artists can imagine, or all that. So I was thinking about how we could somehow go back in history, almost like time travelers, to borrow ideas to somehow reconstruct certain memories, or to construct new spaces which can give us new possibilities. And I'm thinking about that in relation to art simply as a gift, because there are so many contradictions within the work. And, there is no reason why an artist collecting jute sacks and making an artwork out of it should sell for some hundred, like a couple of hundreds, like for instance, a few $1,000s. But if you think about the capital as material, it can somehow come back into the very society which it's coming from, to create new sets of conditions. So I was always thinking about how the conditions within the work could somehow come back and create new narratives. So when we started the Savannah Center for Contemporary Art, I started working with a group of young artists in the community, both at the university in Kumasi, Bernard Akwe Jackson, Kwesi Oheniaye, Dr. Karikacha, Salom Kuji, many others, Robin Riskin, to find ways in which we could somehow construct new narratives in which the experience of art itself could take a very different turn. Of course, from historical images, there have been all these heavy machines like trains which were brought into the continent and in Ghana in the late 19th century, early 20th century for exploitation of commodities. I was more interested in these images and how they could inspire us to somehow create new visions. So I've taken inspiration from these images to collect old airplanes from the capital and to transport them almost 700 kilometers away into these rural areas where we can create new types of institutions. So using the road, which ordinarily you wouldn't find like objects like this crossing. And then, yeah, I remember one of those days when we're transporting it, there was some kind of, all the children who were in school, everyone had to close because it was such a big event. So I'm very much interested in what happens when artists somehow take these kinds of responsibilities or do these kinds of interventions, and what it means like in terms of imagination and consumption of art and culture for the next generation. So this is just a general drone image of Red Clay, which is my studio, which is one of the institutions I've been working on, and how the objects play a role within it towards pedagogy and exhibitions and many other things. So how does the artist studio actually contribute towards a shift in the way that art is actually experienced? And also the building of collectives, working with younger artists to build new kinds of spaces, new kinds of energies that can allow us to be able to interact or experience art in ways that we wouldn't have ordinarily. So these are just examples of some of the exhibitions. This is the last exhibition, a retrospective of 60-year-old Ghanaian artist Ajimon Osei, which 3 artists actually in Ghana curated. So they're mostly the exhibitions are within our different spaces. And we focused a lot of the exhibitions actually on like school kids. So for us, it's very important that we are able to connect different generations, actually even into looking at like modern art and bringing it into like contemporary discourse and all that. And the institution always designed in such a way that it's almost like a classroom. So my colleague, Salom Kuji, who is the artistic director, and our other colleagues, Esinam and others, do these workshops in the spaces that actually collapse the spaces between the works and then the young audiences who somehow experience this. And these are some of the workshops still in the spaces. So ordinarily, this would have been my studio, but we use it as we always install in such a way that we could actually do workshops and things within it. And the institution hosts a lot more. So I've gifted all the works that I've done in my practice in the last 8 years to the institution. So the institution is forever expanding. So the idea is to be able to build the institution to a point where it hosts collections and commissions and all that. Where I'm very much into like the idea of the artist building and taking responsibility within the landscape. So there was a project I did in Manchester in 2019, the Parliament of Ghosts, which is this. But coming back to Ghana, I thought there was a need to build a parliament as a physical space as part of the institution. So I started building the parliament, but into the ground, not building the parliament as a stage, but building it as part of the architecture of the institution. So we use it for all kinds of events, workshops, and it's a work of art. So we also have like young people come in there to actually understand the significance of what art means within the 21st century. And some of these images actually show the relationship between the parliament in use and the parliament in construction. So I'm more interested in the question of what it means actually to build work within the 21st century and what the implications of this might be. And these are some of the airplanes within the landscape, which we use the cockpit as classrooms. We do drawing workshops and all kinds of things in them. We've taken out the seats from the fuselage, and we we transform them into classrooms where we host drone and tech workshops. We discuss issues of agriculture in relation to the landscape, biotech, and many other things. And it's not, we don't only end there, but we try to take the idea of the artistic transformation back into the classroom. So by going into the local communities and taking equipment and other things, the projectors, TVs, and reenacting these workshops that we do within the local settings. Yeah, so basically the idea is being able to introduce a very young generation to art. So at least the questions that we were asking as children would change, or there will be a shift in the lens and the perspective at which they look at things with. Some of the children have actually even understood some of these technologies that we're teaching to a point where they can now teach other children in the local language. And I think that that's when art actually becomes a bit radical. I know we're talking about radicality. I don't actually think that my work is radical, but I think that my work proposes radical shifts in the way that art can be experienced in this century that we find ourselves. So this is the last image. And I think that it's important to go back to the image of the work that I'm known for, which is the jute sack. Because when you think about all the images that I showed with all the institutions acquiring older spaces and converting them into cultural institutions, building new spaces, doing workshops with all these children, you don't think about the image of the jute sack and how tattered it is. These are the objects that normally would contain the cocoa beans, which will go to Europe, which the excess capital is then now brought in the form of NGOs to support starvation programs in Africa and things like that. But I'm just interested in how this image, no matter how failed or apocalyptic it seems, it is the same image or object that allows capital to be reborn in a way that allows for the institution or art to grow in a different direction. So basically that is just about the thoughts and ideas at the moment. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Why don't we go to Deborah to introduce your work, and then afterwards we can ask a couple of questions.
Hi. Thank you, Petrina. Thank you, Ibrahim. That was really interesting, and thank you for sharing your work. I will go ahead and do a screen share. I know, Petrina, some of the conversation we had before going into this talk centered around, like what is radical, and also I think we kind of touched on the canon. I'm going to probably frame what I talk about regarding my practice within a comment that you made about a student who said, Miss, I don't get this kind of painting. I'll start more from less recent work and then work my way up to what I'm doing right now. Let me do the screen share. And then, is everybody seeing my screen? Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to first mention that though my work, some of the concerns in my work are heavier. I may be concerned with how we organize space, social space, and physical space, and geographic space. And how we organize ourselves in that space, that my work really starts from a place of play, right? And giving myself a permission or giving myself that kind of, legitimizing play in my practice, right? And this idea that mediating with the materials, playing with the materials is a good starting point for me, right? And I think that has implications, social implications in terms of my context, the context that I'm from, and what is generally considered to be legitimate, right? Given how we understand gender or how we understand race, etc. Who's allowed to play, who's allowed to just explore, who's allowed to just mediate. So I start from that space, and then any other implications and concerns kind of creep in. And I work with the first image I'm showing is a digital photograph. I work a lot with live plants, living plants, and that was from 2015, as well as this sculpture. This is a photograph from the National Gallery, an exhibition at the National Gallery. I work a lot with mirrors, soil, live plants, and painting. And I'm really, as I said, starting from this place of seeing, what kinds of relationships I'm echoing in the work, what kinds of relationships I'm rejecting. And that really, again, just starts from showing up to the work, showing up to the medium. And again, my concerns creep in. I'm an avid gardener, so it's no surprise that live plants come into the work. And then there's a level of subversiveness in this too, right? Because whoever is the custodian of the work, then by the very nature of the work, also has to become somewhat of a gardener and has to put in some level of effort into maintaining the livelihood of the artwork itself. This work is clay and acrylic, and of course soil and live plants. As some of these earlier experiments were outdoors and again meant to be encounters, the work is brings in the audience and thinks about the audience, or rather the participants' presence in the work as an encounter, right? And as a set of encounters. What exactly is that encounter like? What kinds of assumptions do we bring to that encounter? And like social encounters, there's a level of opacity that we sort of allow each other to have, and then depending on how that encounter goes and how sustained it is, what gets revealed along the way. This particular work is titled Lesser Than, Greater Than, and it's in this particular, the titles themselves are an extension of the artwork, right? And in this particular case, I was referencing or playing with this idea of hierarchy, and what exactly, where in the hierarchy in a social hierarchy, one might find themselves seemingly randomly placed in that particular, at any particular encounter on any particular moment, right? And in that, suggesting really the malleability of that kind of system. And really, how does one collapse these kinds of concerns or these kinds of thoughts into a sort of aesthetic, really, right? And a lot of it is just about, a certain unsuspectingness or a certain unexpectedness. And this particular work is titled, You Thought I Didn't Hear You When You Said You Love My Brown Pear-Shaped Body and Dry Nappy Hair, But I Heard You. And so, as I said, the titles are sometimes meant to give some kind of clue into what kind of landscape we're working with, or what kind of system you're kind of you've encountered when you encounter the work. Again, I'm working with ceramic and acrylic paint and mirrors in various shapes. I'm going to go back up to this work because I also want to talk about even the use of the mirrors as a way to, again, sort of bring the audience into the work, bring them into the work, maybe first as an audience member, but then as a part of the work, and therefore as a participant in the work, right? A participant in the system. And then I kind of play with how these mirrors or how these reflections might occur in the work, right? Are you appearing in the work as a drip? Are you appearing in the work as some kind of excrement from some sort of biomorphic space or orifice? And so, you know, it's very much a matter of bringing in a sort of inner world or inner space, starting from that inner space. And there is an opacity and a sort of unknowingness and void to that inner space that perhaps and someone encountering might not have full access to, but is certainly invited to start. This is an you mentioned an unlikely birth, Petrina, in my bio. This is an installation view of that exhibition. I wanted to show this installation view because it brings in some of the layers in my sculptural practice. Some of the other layers, it's not it's that go beyond working with just clay, but also thinking about it as constructed spaces. So this particular work, the distraction of symbolism, is a vernacular architecture, well, vernacular for our space here in Jamaica, architecture, which is also a sort of viewing station in which to interact with a video work that was made here, and also a growing room with grow lights that were powered by the audience members who encountered and entered into that space. So again, it's this sort of subversive, or rather a sort of flipping or playing around with relationships. So, you know, you've entered into a space to, in a sort of voyeuristic way, a sort of embodied space to view, but then it's set up in a way as to put forward a series of steps that you now have to labor and execute labor in that space in order to engage in a particular way. And then again, that interacts and plays with. So I suppose an unlikely birth and the distraction of symbolism was another step for me into thinking how some of the relationships I'm talking about in the work, which come from a space of outsiderness or otherness, come from a space of questioning social organizing, questioning aesthetics, questioning, you know, what's considered to be an aesthetic material. I didn't mention that a lot of these dark fields or dark spaces and masses in the work are Afro-kinky hair that I've purchased from a beauty supply store. So I'm thinking about aesthetics in the work in not just in a way that is beyond you know, the history of painting or the history of art and what's considered you know, canonized art, but also, you know, socially, like what is considered to be of aesthetic value, right? And so in a way, I'm kind of forcing that, or rather imposing that aesthetic value into the work in a tangible way. And again, it's coming from a space of a lot of these ideas again are, you know, are coming from a sort of embodied space, a very a space of my own subjecthood. So, and then I wonder, and then I consider, you know, within our social hierarchy, how valid my subjecthood is. And I mean, of course, this is all implied in what I've said so far, but how valid is my subjecthood? How valid is my experience, my own joy? And that extends then beyond thinking about ourselves and in our particular social systems, to then the subjecthood of, you know, other species, and 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 how we sort of impose these kinds of hierarchies on the actual world beyond just our human to human relationships. This particular work is titled I. It's also ceramic, and again, soil and living plants. I think this work probably more closely shows the how the African key here and the mirrors interplay in the work, in the paintings. And I'm going to just go through a few more slides before going into some of the more recent works. These works that we're going through right now are paintings on paper, again using some of the symbols that have come up in the work throughout, and also the African key here. This is inside of the distraction of symbolism. Again, the video in the work is a video that was made here. I wanted to bring within this whole idea of talking about gender, race, etc., how geopolitics figures into that in ways that affect us, not just our economic situation or food security, etc. And then bringing that into a space that, of course, was outside of Jamaica, into a space that is, a white box, a space that and within that actual white box, creating an interior space that even questions the larger works that I have exhibited around the architectural structure itself, questioning even just the value systems and even the whole process of canonizing that, and the title of the work again is another example of the extension of the work, which is the distraction of symbolism, the sort of aesthetic negotiations, or the aesthetic push and pull in some ways are very distant and irrelevant to the tangible issues that they come out of. These are just installation photos from the view of inside, a view into the dwelling from outside through a window. And then I'm going to just take 5 minutes to talk about some of the current work that I'm doing. This is it's titled the Training Stations, and I'm doing this work as part of a fellowship with the Open Society Foundation, which I'm happy is the way that I actually discovered Olu's work through the Soros Arts Fellowship. So this is a step further from the work that you just saw, the distraction of symbolism, to thinking how might that, because a work like that would be totally irrelevant in that the installation itself, I believe, would be irrelevant in the way that it existed in Philadelphia, is somewhat irrelevant in a space like Jamaica where the actual work comes from, right? It becomes, in a sense, that work as it existed in the ICA questioned participants with the notion or the assumption that they are located within the global north, right? They are going to engage these objects outside of that dwelling as aesthetic objects, and aesthetic objects that come out of a set of concerns, questions, a set of problems. And then what then are those problems which then you could engage more closely in tenuous ways inside of the shack. Now, when I'm thinking about the space that I live in, what kinds of interventions is there even a way that these kinds of aesthetic questions have been working with? Is there a way to step, to sort of expand that field of aesthetics into something that is functional, into something that that can reconfigure the social relationships that the work is coming from? And so training stations, as I'm working on it, is operating on a couple levels, right? So it's reforestation. The image I showed you is in the cockpit country. Let me go right back up. It's in the cockpit country in St. James, here in Jamaica, in Maroon Town, in an area that's largely deforested. I mean, it may not at first appear as a deforested space to you, but that's all bamboo, which is invasive, which binds up the land and prevents other things from growing. So part of this project is about reforestation, but also building a space there, the training stations, which will be a location for us to engage and experience a media, a video and audio work that I'm working on currently, archiving the conversations that I'm having within this space where I have family ties, but some of the same pressures and the same issues that that I've sort of touched on are the pressures that sort of splinter people out of these kinds of spaces and lose connection. And so it's a space that I have family ties in, and it's a space that we are currently working in to create this sort of listening booth, this audio booth, and using materials that are right there in situ. So it's an in situ sculpture, using what we have there for the most part. We're making these clay blocks and the sculpture, which is going to be a little bit larger than life size. Then this is where we are. We're building right now, and we're planting. We've planted about 147 trees right now, and we're, watching and we're learning and we're and growing with the project. And this is where I'll probably leave off. And then Petrina, hopefully some of your questions will address some more details. Thank you, Petrina. You're muted though, Petrina.
No, I was saying thank you. Why don't we switch over to Olu? I am aware of the time, and I want to ensure that the audience's questions are answered. So Olu, let's turn it over to you.
Sure. I need to share my screen as well, I think. And I think that should come up soon. Right. Okay, it's a little laggy, but yeah, it's been 5 decades now since I've been making work, since the 80s to the present. So it's a bit of a challenge. It's always a challenge to try to encapsulate that breadth of practice in a forum like this. So I'm going to actually focus very briefly on this particular work, which happens to be the most recent work that has garnered a lot of attention. And not just because of the controversies and attention that it garnered in the media and so on and so forth, but also because it, in many ways, I think in many ways represents the aspect of my work which is relevant to our discussion today. In 2017, I was invited to participate in an international contemporary art event called Documenta, which Ibrahim was also part of. This takes place in the city of Castle in Germany and lasts 100 days. This time around, though, the artistic director, Adam Timczyk, the Polish curator, and the rest of the curators working with him decided to host the event, not just in Germany, but in Athens, Greece as well. So the participating artists, most of us were asked to propose work for not just the venues in Castle, but in Athens as well. And I believe Ibrahim actually was in Athens for several months making work, which was very exciting. Now, I knew what work I wanted to make for Athens, but wasn't quite sure what would fit in Castle because I've never been there. So I did make the site visit and decided to also look into the history of the city, as well as the politics and the contemporary events and tensions, because I began to feel like it would make sense to make a site-specific work in Castle itself. And while I was doing that research, I came across this particular document, and it's called the Edict of Castle, and it was issued in 1685 by the Prince Potentate of Castle, the Landgraf he was called, Karl. And this is an order or offer of asylum to at the time persecuted French religious group called the Huguenots. And as early as 1685, this prince granted asylum to anyone of any member of that religious group who was willing to or wanted to emigrate to Castle. It was also actually called a document of concessions and privileges. So they were protected. They could come in. They would have the liberty and freedom to not only live in Castle, but also apply their trade. And this is very important, in fact, because what it did was that the Huguenots were known for silver working with silver. And when they came into Castle and into the region of Hessen in Germany, they brought those skills to the area, which is very economically convenient for the prince. But it was very interesting because here we have a document, an offer of asylum going back to 1685, the Middle Ages. But as recently as 2015, which is only just a year or so after before I was invited to take part in Documenta, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel had issued a similar policy, basically allowing refugees fleeing the war in Syria to seek asylum in Germany, and this divided the country very sharply. In Castle itself, lots of people were in support of the policy, but there were also people who were dead against it, who were very opposed to it, who were very angered by it. And several years later, in fact, 2 years ago, last 2 years ago, this would lead to somebody from the far right assassinating one of the politicians in Castle, who was in support of Angela Merkel's policy. So looking at the Edict of Castle from 1685 and Angela Merkel's policy in 2015 and all that happened in between, it seemed to me like the question of immigration and flight, and refuge, which is something that I've worked on for many years. In fact, going back to 1983, when I was still a student, when I was working on my own personal experience as a child refugee in the war in Biafra, I thought this was very appropriate. I'd also worked for several years in London as a volunteer working with asylum seekers in Britain. So this made sense to explore. As for the form itself, we weren't quite sure how this would manifest. So this was actually my initial idea for the work. This is at a train station, the main train station in Castle. And I thought that something that had to do with migrants and immigrants and refugee seekers, since this is the first portal into the city, something welcoming would be appropriate, but this never happened. Now, in terms of the content of the work, I also thought of a favorite passage from the Christian scriptures that I'd used in several other works in the past in different forms. And this comes from the story of Jesus in the book of Matthew. I'm not religious myself, but I was raised Christian, and my father is a Christian preacher, and I was a child preacher, just like James Baldwin when I was a child. So this is a place where Jesus talks about how he was a stranger and he was welcomed in by people. And it resonates because, in fact, Jesus was also an immigrant child who was raised in Egypt, according to the scriptures. So taking that word from Jesus himself to address this question in a nation or part of the world that likes to regard itself as a Christian nation or a Christian civilization made a lot of sense. But I was also actually looking at it in two different ways. I wasn't simply looking at it in terms of irony, which is how it's been interpreted by some people, but also in terms of not just charity, but gratitude, because the passage itself, where Jesus is talking about this, he was not only charging people to do similar things, but he was also expressing gratitude, even if the parable itself never happened. So I took the fragment of text from the book of Matthew, the Gospel according to Matthew, and decided to manifest it on some platform, first in German, as we can see here. But ultimately, when this particular idea became impossible to realize, we began to think of some other way to do the work. Then I was told that this would be a more appropriate place as the center of Castle to make this work. And while I was in conversation with Adam and Bonaventure and others, we decided that since the other idea was not practicable, how about I do an obelisk? In fact, this is the first sketch of what became the castle obelisk from Documenta. I made this while visiting Athens for the same purpose. And then we pursued this, and I think the form of the obelisk itself made sense because it sort of goes back to Egypt, right? And Jesus was an immigrant child in Egypt. And whereas in the past, obelisks in Europe have symbolized imperialism, the power of occupation, the power of European power, European governments and European emperors to go into Africa and take things and bring them back to Europe. And whereas also in the history of the obelisk itself, it was sort of a platform for the pharaohs to narrate their exploits and their victories in war. I thought that it made sense to reinterpret that form and to use it in this particular way. So it's an arcane form, but I was very excited to try to explore new ways of putting it to use. And it's a form that is loved by people in their city centers, especially in Europe. So it kind of made sense, and the work was very warmly received when it was first installed. So this, we decided to do it in English, in Arabic, in Turkish, as well as German. And I wanted it to be a place where people could also interact with the work in the way that they normally do not interact with monuments, because monuments are usually, especially obelisks, they're sort of sectioned off, and you can view them from afar, and you can, take photographs and so on. But I wanted something that people could have a bodily experience with, which sort of worked out very well here. As some of our viewers and listeners might know, this work drew a lot of controversy because the far right party in Germany, the Alternative for Germany, was very opposed to the work and pressured the city government of Kassel to dismantle the work and remove it. And this got worse when the city decided to buy the work or to retain the work after Documenta. And over a whole year of controversy and trauma, and discussions and protests, and negotiations involving politicians, the media, civic society organizations, local artists in the area, and the whole community. The work was eventually removed by the city on October the 3rd of 2018. In fact, in the middle of the night, the city sent in these tractors to remove the work. So people woke up in the morning and this is what they found where the work originally was. Here they were carrying it away. This again drew a lot of very vehement response, which is what I wanted from for the work, but in a positive way. I didn't want it to be in a negative way. People threw flowers into the spot and so on and so forth, almost venerating the absence of the work. This is one of the protests where people were calling for the work to be reinstalled. And for 6 months, the work was actually just dumped in some, I don't know where that was. But we sort of continued to campaign for the work to be reinstalled because it had become emotionally important for a lot of people in the community, not just the artist community, but immigrant community, for civic society, for advocates for refugees and asylum seekers and immigrants and so on. And finally, we managed to get the city to reinstall the work, but the compromise was that it was not reinstalled in the original place in the center of the city. They went about 100 meters or so away from the original place to reinstall the work, which is fine by me because it continues to be very relevant to the community. People still use the work for rallies, for protests, especially activists who engaged in helping immigrants and asylum seekers, which is what I hadn't anticipated for the work. The original idea for the work was the message, to address the complexity of the message that the founder of the Christian religion put forward in that parable about him being a stranger and being welcomed in. That was all I intended originally. And to make the connection, of course, with Egypt and with Africa and so on, the Middle East. But the work took on a life of its own, which is the best that you can hope for as far as the work is concerned. I don't know how we're doing for time, because this is the long and short of the story of this particular work. And like I said, it sort of encapsulates the aspect of my work that might fit into the rubric of, I suppose, radical practice. And these are themes and issues that I've dealt with over the years and continue to deal with. You know, and I know we're supposed to also reflect on the Black Lives Matter events and how art has responded to that. Interestingly enough, in 2015, I was making work around the Black Lives Matter movement before 2020. But of course, things took off in a different direction in 2020 in terms of creative response, leaving the hands of artists per se, or established artists, or gallery artists or African-American artists who are in the museums and so on, that things went out of their hands completely. From my point of view, the most important most influential creative response to the protests in 2020 was the mural on the street that Mayor Bowser of Washington, D.C. commissioned. It wasn't anything that anybody did that's in a museum at the Whitney Museum or the Museum of Contemporary Art or whatever. So anyway, I've probably run out of time. I wanted to introduce that particular work as a sort of a background to how I work and research and to try to find out about a particular area and to respond to things. And I, in fact, also sort of dial back to one of the several issues that I've been dealing with over the years as an artist. And I think that there's other aspects that we can talk about or touch upon when there are questions maybe about this particular work or some other aspect of my practice. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Olu. I'm also aware of the time, and I think there are also people with that are now sending in questions. I had a few questions. Some of them you all answered in your presentations, or at least responded to those questions. So before I start asking questions, I really do want to give people an opportunity to talk, since we have about 20-something minutes or so. One question that came in was about other artists historically or today that you all find interesting or sort of radical. And that might be a sort of nice way to begin to kind of engage this conversation. Don't all go all at once.
I can address that. When I was starting out, Charles White, the African American artist, was one of my heroes. But at present, there are several artists out there who are working in the radical tradition. I think that's a better way to put it. Ai Weiwei, for instance, the Chinese artist, has been a very vocal advocate for migrants and refugees. He was himself a refugee in Brooklyn, and that has inspired or informed his response to the question of migration and the experience of immigrant communities at present. So that's someone whose activist dedication I find interesting. Of course, I'm also blown away by what Ibrahim is doing in all the other projects that he's engaged in. And I think we all owe much to someone like Ella Natri, who was my professor, but who is also very important in Ghana and in Africa, and who introduced me, along with others, to the idea of creating work that is socially responsible. Because right into the 80s, right through the 70s into the 80s, I think that in contemporary art, high modernism was still very influential. The idea that if you made work that was quote unquote emotional or sentimental, then that was problematic. And I had a debate with someone about, well, not a debate, but I had an engagement with someone about that recently. Artists like Ella Natri and artists of the Nsoka School, which was where I studied, were of a different view, built on African art traditions that combine entertainment and decoration and tutelary or religious services and purposes with social responsibility. So Ella Natri is obviously another artist who people may not perceive as being a radical artist or having a radical practice, but he certainly does. There are several others, Narrow Ward and so on and so forth. I could go on and on. Magdalena Campos Ponce, the Cuban artist, but I'll leave the floor for others to respond as well.
Do you want to go ahead, Ibrahim, or should I go? All right. I mean, like Olu mentioned, yeah, there have been many artists that have influenced my work or who have drawn inspiration from over the course of the time that I've had a practice. So I mean, so the artists I would mention today wouldn't be the artists that I would have mentioned 20 years ago or 15 years ago. But in terms of artists who stayed with me, I continually go back to someone's like Namjoon Paik's practice. When I discovered his work or first encountered his work 20 years or so ago, I think that shifted the well, or sort of widened the well of inspiration that I could draw from, or sort of shifted what I thought could be possible in a practice, and did what I thought, what I thought really, wouldn't it be great if the kind of experience that I had encountering his work, if that experience could happen more often. Technology, the use of technology, and how technology and nature and society, how those all interact together. But also, Senga Ngudi is an artist whose work I have had a lot of tremendous respect for, and who also opened up similarly what I thought would be possible through our practice, And again, also even the whole idea of like aesthetics as a way of socially relating, that was really important for me to see as an artist, a younger artist. But yeah, so many others though. So many others. David Hammond's, lesser known artists like Beverly Buchanan. I was really happy to have encountered her work. The list goes on and on. And I haven't mentioned any painters, but there have been so many painters. And I think even some unlikely painters too. I mean, when I think even of like the first time I came up upon, like, you know, for example, an abstract expressionist painting, and I thought, well, coming from a space like Jamaica, Petrina, where I think going back to this, your same students and their reaction set is very telling in terms of what are you allowed to do? What are you even allowed to consider to be art? I think just having out that wider well of what's possible has been great. And I think there's also,
No, I was just going to say, for the audience, just a bit of context. I had sent a message to the group, to Deborah in particular, because when I was discussing her class, discussing her work in my class, one student just, you know, in exasperation, just said, "Miss, I just don't understand. I just don't understand her work." And so that's where that comment is coming from. Maybe this is an opportunity to talk about language and radicality. And you know, many of you work with in a sort of conceptual way, and if we could talk about language and the engagement with the audience, and you know, how do you reconcile that there are audiences who may not engage, who may not know how to engage your work, even though your work is committed to social engagement. So, and this is somebody that anybody can answer that question.
Maybe Ibrahim this time.
Yes.
Still there.
We might have lost him.
I think we lost Ibrahim.
Yeah, we might have lost him.
You want to go, Deborah?
I was just about to say, you, Olu, if you don't, I mean, I just finished. I feel like I just took that last question. I'd love to hear somebody else's voice.
Well, talking about the question of language and access in terms of communication and understanding. There's several other issues involved. I think literacy is one of the more problematic words that's associated with that. That is visual literacy, or having the equipment and tools to read and understand a work of art. And I think part of what happens with contemporary viewers is that not only is the knowledge of contemporary art lacking, in many instances there's also a lack of knowledge of traditional forms coming from their own society.
Yeah.
In the sense that if they were familiar with even just their own art traditions, they would have less difficulty understanding what contemporary artists are doing, because in many instances contemporary artists are actually just drawing from traditions. You know, if you look in my own work, for instance, I look at two traditions from my part of Igbo land in West Africa, some of which I think was transferred to Jamaica and other places. We have two traditions. One is called Mbari. It's a tutelary religious art, and it's an all-encompassing form, which is architecture, sculpture, painting, installation, narrative, everything brought together. And the work itself is made by volunteers from the community under the supervision of a master artist. And this work is then dedicated to the deity of the earth. So there you have a multimedia piece that I draw from. In fact, I aspire to being able to make that kind of work. And then we have something called Abibo. People can look this up on YouTube, because there are examples of this on YouTube. And this is a popular music devoted to social criticism. So, you're talking rap. That's like proto-rap coming from, I don't know how many centuries back in time. So when I make art that addresses social issues, I'm drawing from that. And in many instances, when I paint, I'm drawing from forms and motifs that are coming from Mbari and other forms. I think people come to contemporary art thinking, my God, we must have to have a special kind of preparation or knowledge in order to grasp what's going on here, And in many instances, all they actually need to do is to relax and interact with the work and let it speak to them. And if they can't make sense of it, they can then ask questions. But I think they're stumped, they're sort of pushed into a defensive position. For me, I think the most communication is important, but the conceptual efficacy of the language is also very important. Like, what does it say? I try to use forms as vehicles, right? I mean, as the first thing that the viewer encounters, so that there's a bond, there's communication there in spite of what I'm trying to say, and once I'm able to establish that initial communication or interaction, then they can get into the work. The obelisk, for instance, people, the process of making the obelisk in Castle for Documenta, at first we did not have the text on it. So people were very excited to just have an obelisk in the center of their city. This is something that somebody else had proposed about 400 years before. It never happened. And now they had an obelisk like any other major city. The videos on YouTube where people in Castle are saying, oh, now we're going to get our own obelisk, just like Washington, D.C., and just like Rome and Paris, so on and so forth. So people could respond to that form. It's only when we then put the text on it that problems arose. And that's the point, that people could respond to the language. And then the message is layered on top of that. So, but I encourage people to just take it easy. You don't need to be a brain surgeon. Maybe you need to, you could be, but you don't need to be a brain surgeon to understand contemporary art.
Well, Ibrahim has just notified us that he's having issues with the internet connection. But there is, I think, a young artist who wanted to ask for your, what advice could you give to young Africans? And I'm going to broaden it to African diaspora young artists to becoming a significant artist. That was the question. So what advice would you all give to young artists starting out in their practice? And I'm going to throw out another question too, while you guys are thinking about this. Do you ever, another question that came in, do you ever get scared by the power of your work? And this question came in for Olu, but I wanted to broaden it to any of the to the other panelists. Do you ever get scared? Because your work is committed to social engagement. So do you ever get scared by it?
I'll let Olu answer that first because the question was directed to him.
No, it's fine though. You can go.
Inspirational words, please, for the young artists.
Yes. Okay. The question was about artists originally said young African artists. You broaden it to African diaspora artists. I do think, I mean, I am inclined to believe that a lot of the challenges overlap in terms of being a young artist here in Jamaica and being a young artist on the continent, in terms of economy, in terms of marginalization, in terms of geopolitics. But also here we have challenges regarding the presence of institutions or organizations that artists typically rely on, or artists typically engage with as a means to help them develop their practice. So for artists here, I would say, or in an artist in a space like that, I would say that the first thing to do is to show up to your practice on a regular basis, however small that however unmonumental that might look, however tiny those moments might look, that you continue to honor your practice and yourself in that way. And then I think a lot can come out of that sort of small ritual. And I also believe in appraising or accounting for the resources that you do have within and that you do have around you, however humble those resources may be, or however illegitimate you may think those resources are, that those are your resources, and that your resources can be used. Your resources, you have the agency to change the way that you interact with those resources as a creative practice in and of itself, like how you mediate those resources, whether it's painting, whether it's earth, whether whatever it is, whether it's your social relationships, those are all legitimate art practices. I consider myself to be a visual artist. I think all of that all of those are legitimate visual practices or potentials for visual practices. And and to be in touch with your peers, to be in touch with people, and to simultaneously. But I think the most important part is to show up to yourself, show up for yourself in your practice.
Can I throw the question out to Ibrahim, since he's now back with us? So before you get kicked off the internet, what advice would you give to young artists? Or you can also answer the question about being terrified or scared of the power of your work and the work that you're doing.
Well, that's a tricky one. I guess just yesterday, my colleague and I, who is the artistic director of the institution, Salom, were talking about this, like the sense of bravery that we bring into practice. Yeah, because we've been asking this question in the last 1 year, because since last year, there's been this, since the Black Lives Matter movement became really strong, there's been this new wave of like arts, like involving like artists mainly making Black bodies and things like that. And we studied painting at the university, you know, and as a young artist, we used to make like figurative work and all that. But at some point, we decided that we were going to somehow take up new responsibilities and maybe create new forms that could somehow change the trajectory of like artistic practice and its history within our context in a way. So we constantly ask ourselves why we make these choices of, for instance, making the type of work that we make and the interventions that we make. And no matter how difficult it seems and no matter how scary it is, because you have to go through a big hurdle and go through a series of bureaucracies and a series of negotiations in order to get the tiniest possible thing done. But I guess that is the exciting thing about art, is that there is some sense of freedom and justice and social equality that art somehow proposes, constantly proposes. But in my understanding and experience of art in the last couple of years, I've always realized that art has somehow always comes a bit short of it because of the intervention of the market, and also like constant speculation. So I guess that if you have a practice and you have ideas, and those ideas don't actually scare you, then for me, sometimes I don't think that it would actually affect the art world in the way that it's going to grow or take a new shape. I guess the most important things that students have to understand is that when you're making art, you're not making art actually just to please the world. You're making art because you want to propose a new forms of vision and new ways in which the world can re-experience itself. So for me, that is very important. We cannot, we are not entrepreneurs or businessmen or scientists. We are artists, and at the end of the day, there is no one particular rule that actually explains or summarizes the way we think. But I think that the way we think should be able to influence the world and should be able to open the world in such a way that it will come with new hopes and aspirations towards the way we experience and live within it, and eventually also looking outside of it. So fear is actually very vital when you're actually conceiving ideas or thoughts. You should make room for it, because without that, you would just end up being comfortable with everything that you do, because the art world is very quick to celebrate everything. And but it doesn't mean that everything that it celebrates is it's that true legitimate form that can somehow propose like those freedoms that we constantly talk about within art. So I guess sometimes it comes through very difficult means and circumstances, but we just have to constantly push through it.
Yeah, I would echo what Deborah and Ibrahim already said. In my case, though, it's very interesting because I've often made work that made people cry. And that could be a scary thing. Work that people basically encounter and they become very emotional. I exhibited a work several years ago in Geneva as part of a group exhibition at the World Health Organization headquarters in Geneva. And one of the artists had come from, I believe, Sarajevo. So there was a television crew that came from there to cover this artist's work. And they happened to also record my work. And then went back and showed that on television. And they got back to me to say they were flooded with calls from their viewers, people crying, not about the work of the artist that they came to cover, but about my work. And this particular work, in fact, addressed disappearing children, which is something that then becomes relevant again today. When in more recent times, this is like 25, 24, 20, I don't know, 20, 25 years ago. I don't remember now. But today now we have extremist religious terrorists kidnapping children in West Africa. That was not the reason I made the work back then, but it was relevant to people in war-torn Sarajevo, or a place that's just coming out of war, to reflect on missing children and dead children and so on and so forth. So when you make work of that nature that makes people cry, it can be scary, but I don't respond to work that way because it doesn't scare me. And I think perhaps what it is the question should probably be about doubt, self-doubt, perhaps. You have to have a certain self-doubt as to whether what you're doing is actually relevant. That's a recurring challenge for artists, to ask yourself, does this make sense? What's the point of this? Being scared, no, I'm not scared. It doesn't matter what the far right does about my work in Germany. That doesn't scare me. What I do have is the self-doubt as to whether the work is making any difference. I see people protesting about to protect the work. I see people responding to it. At the beginning of the year, I just posted something on Facebook. At the beginning of the year, a pastor from one of the parishes near Castle actually gave his sermon of the first Sunday after the Epiphany near the obelisk, using the obelisk and its message as the center of his sermon of the Epiphany. I feel somewhat validated in the creative choices I made. When things like that happen, it doesn't scare me. I think what happens is you battle with self-doubt all the time as to whether the choices you're making in terms of language, in terms of material, in terms of even subject matter, is efficacious. Is it working? Is it making a difference? Does it matter even? And sometimes you sort of self-justify, you sort of reassure yourself that it doesn't matter, it's just fun. And all of that is relevant. If you're making work to communicate, you're going to have that self-doubt. If you don't have that self-doubt, then maybe you're lucky. As to what young artists should do, well, I came up on the continent as a young artist. I left the continent when I was 24. So the early part of my practice began there. And what I did, this is sort of going back to what Deborah said earlier on in terms of just do it, and use the account for the resources that you have available. Use what's there for you. I was trained to paint on canvas and use oils and so on and so forth, in a very traditional manner. But one of the earliest things that I did as an artist was actually to abandon that and to begin to use materials that I just found around, not because there was a lot of references for doing that, but because I felt like, well, I was raised in the rural areas. I wasn't raised in the city. And all around me in the rural areas, there were still extant traditions of Igbo art that were happening. And if that was art, then what am I doing with oils and canvas? It just didn't make it, didn't make a lot of sense. So back then, I actually published a lot of manifestos and things like that. And I published something that I called a conversation with myself, which is a conversation with myself, addressing those issues that all around me in Nigeria at the time, my generation of artists, everyone was trying to, beat themselves up over having access to oils and canvas and so on and so forth. And it just didn't, it's like people use the abundance of creative resource available to us and the traditions. Let's work from that. And that's the advice that I'll give to a young artist. But I would also say that it's important to be entrepreneurial. And I was when I was a young artist. I'm not that good now, but I was. I sold a lot of work. I don't sell a lot of work now, but I did when I was starting out, because I strongly believe in the relevance of the ability to sustain yourself in your practice as an artist. Because the society has this thing that art is just, oh man, you just give them a little grant and they entertain us, and so it's almost offensive. An artist ought to be able to make a living from making art, in the same way that a plumber is able to make a living doing plumbing, and a baker is able to make a living baking bread. There's no reason why artists should not be able to make a living, or why it feels dirty to some people that someone is trying to sell their work or trying to make a living from their work. And most artists have to teach, or do all the things to make a living just so they can make art. There's something that's not very right about that, but not everyone has the gift that medieval artists had a lot. Michelangelo and all those people were great entrepreneurs. Not everyone has that gift, in which case you have to find someone who can help push your work. But if you have that gift, by all means, try to find sustenance through your work. It's valid, and it's important, because in many instances we're unable to make the work that we want to make because we lack the resources to make that work. So it can also be a limitation to only work with the resources available to you, because sometimes you need more in order to make the ambitious leap that you crave to make. If that's where your heart is, to make that ambitious leap, then you have to find the resources. And in the West, you might have the opportunity to apply for grants and all that. People don't have that in Africa, at least not the part of Africa where I came from. So they have to hustle, And in places like Nigeria, they're actually very good. We were very good. We found the money to do catalogs. We found sponsors. We found patrons. So do that. I've heard it said that's no, I don't want to go there. But what I'm trying to say is that it's valid to do that. It's valid to be resourceful. I think that's the word. You have to be resourceful to support your work, and you have to use what's there and make the best work that you can with it. Sorry for taking too much time to address that.
No, it was great. Well, connected to that, I had a question about institution building. Both Deborah and Ibrahim created their own residency programs or centers, and if you guys could talk about that in relation to what it means to radical practice today. And I think there was another question. I'm aware that we're also over time, so perhaps. There's another question that came in. I have to read it because it's quite long. And so maybe I'll throw out that question and this question that has come in, and we can make these two questions the last for our conversation, although I'm actually quite enjoying this. So the next question was, what are your thoughts, panelists, on the following quote, how can art participate in networks of power that its content willfully rejects? Often so-called political art simply aestheticizes protest or resistance. Sometimes it has the effect of moral licensing, instilling in its viewer a false sense of having accomplished something. Art and power have always been begrudging bedfellows. So the question came in, what are your thoughts? How can art participate in networks of power that its content willfully rejects?
And what was the question before that, Petrina?
And it's about institution building, your residency programs, the center that you have created. In a way, I think it actually connects to this question. I think it partly connects to the question. In that, I do think that Ibrahim, in your presentation, you mentioned the ways that your own, your works cost thousands of dollars, and that you have used that, you have used your financial wealth to create an institution in Ghana. And I feel like the circulation is an important way to think about how art engages power, but at the same time is also limited, or I wouldn't say limited. Limited is the wrong word, but that it engages power in certain ways.
Hello? Hello?
We're hearing you.
We can hear you. We can hear you.
Sorry. Well, sorry, we're in a storm season, so the network is really bad these days. So the for me it's very important, the circulation, how to as Prof. Olu was saying, how to be resourceful and how to be able to sustain oneself through the work that they do. But for me, it's also very important for an artist to understand that maybe sometimes in making work, the work can also lead to maybe a certain transformation within the space that they practice or come from. And in my case, because I started off when I was in art school, a lot of the artists that we studied, particularly artists coming from Nsuka, from where Prof. Olu studied, it was very important for us to be able to think about ways in which we could push the aesthetics, art beyond just the symbolic or aesthetics into like maybe a much more social or radical context. And we were inspired by doing, we were inspired and also encouraged to do a lot of experiments in a city and use all kinds of spaces outside the context of, let's say, a traditional arts institution. That is where my interest of, for instance, visiting like old factories and railways and spaces like that came from. And I took that as a point of inspiration to be able to make work. But then again, I was very much interested in how I could make new work from that, which could allow me to go back in time to be able to intervene within those old spaces. So the institutions are in a way of for me, they are some kind of a reflection of the time that we find ourselves in within our generation, and the possibility of, for instance, creating a different set of narrative, or creating different sets of conditions that allows for new kinds of questions and conditions to emerge. So for me, the power thing is art has always been linked to power, and as you say, right. But for me, I'm thinking of how I can be able to make work that somehow re-examines this relationship, so that at least it empowers many artists and the generation that comes afterwards to be able to at least open another point of entry into the way that art is perceived and art is practiced. Yeah.
I forget what the first question is regarding the institutions that we started. I don't know why that question keeps dropping out of my head. It is, but I'll go ahead and answer the other question, which is the relationship of our practices to power, and this whole notion of aestheticizing power and protest, which I am very much aware of in the work. I think that's going back to this whole notion, I suppose that's why I'm also not particularly, I don't particularly relate to this idea of my work being radical, because I think there is a certain amount of naming, and that is even involved in this whole notion of labeling a work as radical, that my work in and of itself goes against this unnamingness, this unknowingness. And I think in that way, there's a certain amount of, as an outsider and marginalizing that is built into my work that I sort of have to be at peace with in order to even make the work that I do make. I know that the work is not part of canon. It means that it's not work that can be categorized in a specific kind of way, especially locally. But even beyond local, I think that there's a certain amount of comfort, or rather peace that I have, or that I have with just, there's a quietness, right, that I need to have in order to make the work and accept that it is at the margin, it is uncategorized. And I do think that the naming and categorization is in itself a tool of power and hegemony, right? And so working in this way that is fluid is in a way rejecting that on a certain level, right? And so, you know, and in terms of like the market and thinking about power in that way in terms of economy, I mean, really, I'm not sure how it is that I end up getting to make this work, because I'm not an artist who is a gallery artist. I don't have gallery representation. I've just always found ways to make that work, and I've always found ways to engage people with the work. And I also don't take offense when someone doesn't understand the work, or when someone says when the work is unfamiliar or unrecognizable, because that's essentially what someone is saying when they say that, right? It's unrecognizable, it's unfamiliar. And so it's okay to be a stranger. It's okay to be sort of, you know, not popular, right? So it's okay. So that's sort of my relationship with power. And NLS has very much as an art organization survived and thrived in that way as well. You know, what is this organization doing? What kind of work are they showing? How is it so tiny? Why is it even a thing that if it's this tiny, right? So I mean, for most of the existence of NLS, that was the thing. And so because something does not occupy is not monumental. I mean, you mentioned monumental in some of our earlier conversations. Because something is monumental does not mean that it is not legitimate, or it does not mean that it does not have something important to say, just because it's on the margin. And I even think about this idea of center and margin in relation to Olu's work, which is a monument, right? But even think about the fact that Olu's work was actually physically removed from the center to more on the margin, physically remove that. That's the only way it would be allowed to exist, if it was put more towards the margin, right? And so does that mean that the work is not, does that mean in many ways, power as we understand it then becomes something totally different, right? Because the work is powerful, but it may not be power in the way that we understand. We're redefining what it means to actually be powerful, or what it means to actually have agency.
Yes, I totally agree with Deborah and Ibrahim as well. I sense that sometimes when some of these questions arise, some of them come from a place of cynicism as to the pretentious or supposedly pretentious nature of contemporary or modern art involvement in activism. But I think that that's a misunderstanding, because there's several different ways in which contemporary or modern artists engage power, including sometimes not through their work. I always remind people that Pablo Picasso was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party all his life until he died. He was a registered member of the Communist Party, but there was no communism, reflected in his images of women and so on and so forth. What he did was that he created a lot of wealth, which he, unbeknownst to lots of people, then invested in activist work, in political work, in supporting organizations. People are not aware how close Picasso was to some of the central figures of the struggle against imperialism, struggle for independence in Africa. He was very close with many of the leaders of the independence struggle from the Francophone part of Africa, and illustrated their books, for instance, for free. He designed posters for campaigns, and those are different ways that an artist may not be directly engaged in the kind of work that speaks activism, that is the artwork, but is also engaged in being positively active in their community. And I know lots of peers of mine who make work that is not outwardly political, in quotes, but then because they're financially successful through the gallery system, they're then able to go back into their communities and make a difference, which is what Ibrahim is referring to and has exemplified. There are quite a number of others who've done that, which means that one has difficulty with the idea of working outside the gallery system. There's nothing wrong with the gallery system. We make things. We make things, and some of them are desirable. And when they're desirable, people want them. And then there's speculation and so on. So there's a market. Right? Artists do not create the market. The market is there for things that are available to be speculated on or sold on the market. And in many instances, artists need the gallery system in order to survive and continue to make their work. But even more so, artists sometimes working through the commercial or capitalist or gallery market system, then have the sustenance to make important work, as well as be involved in their communities in a positive way, whether they're building schools or they're setting up scholarships or they, building hospitals and so on and so forth. And that happens all the time. One artist I didn't actually mention at the beginning, I forgot, was Banksy. And that's someone that I was cynical about at the beginning. When my students were writing thesis about Banksy and so on, I thought some of that was just a personality cult and had very little to do with Banksy's work. Banksy is someone who has been very engaged in a lot of important campaigns in Palestine and other places, selling his works for ridiculous amounts, selling a drawing for $1 million and then having it shredded. I think that's obscene. But then he uses the money to invest in communities and so on and so forth. So you have to see it together in context. That when artists are engaging with power or even being part of power, it's not connivance, and it should not be treated cynically, because we have to make art. That's what we do. So there's avenues of navigating the negative aspects of power and engaging with power. And in terms of aestheticizing, I think that was the word, aestheticizing protest, there's some sense to that. Ibrahim already spoke to it when he mentioned the preponderance of figurative work in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement. Another friend of mine has referred to it as the return of blackface. So there's a certain kind of work that is now associated with Black power and Black activism, but which at the end of the day is really quite retrograde in its nature and its effects and purposes. So there's that, but there's other kinds of work where people are genuinely making an effort to send across a message, and in some instances, they're very successful. And that has to be appreciated and celebrated. So yeah, I don't know if I addressed the questions, but that's what I have to say about that.
I think you did. I think you absolutely did. And I feel like the conversation went back to some of our internal conversations that we started, that we had amongst us. So I think it's a great question, and I think it's a great set of answers to end the first conversation that the National Gallery has organized. I want to thank all three of you, Olu, Deborah, Ibrahim, for joining us today. And I would also like to thank the National Gallery's staff for just making sure that technically everything went well, and for organizing this. A special thank you to Annie Paul also for sort of getting this all together. And we hope, and to the audience for coming in and staying for this conversation. We hope that you continue to join us for the next set of conversations. I think next Friday, for the entire month of April, there will be a series of conversations on Fridays with artists, and we hope that you continue to join the National Gallery in these very important global conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina.
No problem. Thank you. I realized I never really actually introduced myself, but hi. Deborah,
Thank you. Thank you. And shout out to all my friends and all the Igbo people in Jamaica. Hope to have an opportunity to be there in person someday. It's on my bucket list.
Thank you, Olu. We look forward to having you here. And
Absolutely.
It was great meeting you. Great meeting you, Ibrahim, who looks as if he has fallen out now.
Yes. But actually, if I may, just a last question. Somebody had asked, where can they find out more information about your ongoing work, Deborah, in the cockpit country? So if there's if you could quickly just tell us. Or
there's nowhere to find out that information right now. I'm currently, unless they contact me personally through my website.
Okay.
Which is www.deborahAnzinger.com.
Same here. You know, you have to go to oluoguibe.com or luoguibe.com, and it's there. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.